Hello, everyone. I'm Joel Makower. The exhibition Christina mentioned that just recently concluded at the Museum of Craft and Design was called Survival Architecture and the Art of Resilience. And it's been traveling North America for the past few years. It invited visionary architects and artists to consider artistically interpretive solutions and prototypes for survival shelter in a climate-constrained world and pandemic-constrained world now. As one part of that exhibition, the curator, Randy Rosenberg, the chief curator at Artworks for Change, who put together the exhibition together, commissioned Terreform ONE to create Cricket Shelter, an innovative structure that addresses both sustainable food systems and modular compact architecture. Cricket Shelter is just one of many innovations coming out of Terreform ONE, a nonprofit architecture and urban design research-based consulting group. You'll hear a lot more about them in a couple of minutes. Its focus is on combating the extinction of all planetary species through pioneering acts of design. Today, I'm very pleased to have Terreform ONE's co-founder, Joachim, and its executive director, Vivian Kuan. Mitch is here from Bodensee, Germany, on the Swiss-German border, and Vivian is here from Connecticut, just outside New York City. They're going to give us a deeper dive into the organization, sustainable design, and the art of the possible. They're going to begin with a presentation followed by discussion, at which time you can, we'll take your questions and you can ask them at any time via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Mitch and Vivian, welcome. And Mitch, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Joel. I just remembered as you were talking, I should plug our book that we have been working on for 14 years.
I was going to do that for you, but go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's great to be here with the MCD, and I'm looking forward to our discussion after the presentation that Vivian and I are going to do on our work. It's certainly been one hell of a ride since Randy approached us with this survival architecture concept where we produced the Cricket Shelter project. And it seemed to have taken a life of its own, I guess in every sense of the word or term, life, because it's filled with thousands of crickets and it's meant to feed others. And that project is just one of many things that we work on, Terreform, that involve living organisms in the things that we do. Everything we do, actually, the clients are well, they're alive, and I don't mean humans. I mean any other species that we work with. So it's always an adventure. And the survival architecture exhibition was something that we just didn't want to think about surviving. We want to move beyond that and think of something that would actually contribute to these kinds of super positive, super ecological models that we think about. The Design with Life book on Actar. This is 420 plus pages, 14 years of work, over 400 people. 400 is roughly a number for everything in here that have been involved with the organization since the beginning. It's got tons of projects that we have been doing. It's a great kind of monograph to see all the things that we have been involved with over the years. And it's come out just before the pandemic. So our book opening and our book tour and everything else has been online, which has been interesting. And I think we're going to talk about the pandemic and how that affects cities and how we can do things after this pandemic, which eventually there will be an after, in a way that is completely green and completely sustainable. And what does that look like, getting to civilization 2.0? So I'm going to start with some of the projects that we've been doing. More recent projects, and then I'm going to hand it over to our executive director, Vivian Kuan, who's going to highlight a lot of our programs and other things that we do. So you get a kind of behind the scenes view of how we operate. I guess it's always good to see the little people behind the curtain. I guess we're not just one person in the Wizard of Oz. There's a wizards, plural, of Oz that work at Terreform. So let me start by sharing the screen and getting into our projects. So here, So yeah, as was said, I'm an architect and an urban designer. I did my doctoral work at MIT. Before that, I studied urban design at Harvard and have a degree from there in Columbia. And it wasn't until recently we found out that everything that we're doing has a much, much greater mission than we thought of before. And when you look at a statistic like this, which is, wildlife population is 50% less since the 1970s. That's like every creature on this planet is disappearing. Corals, birds, insects, mammals, fish of all kind, everything's gone. In fact, almost every 7 minutes, we lose something else, and that's just not acceptable. This is the white rhino. There is only 2 left, a mother and a daughter, and they're almost completely extinct. The last of their kind is called an endling. And as architects and urban designers, and as a research think tank, we don't find this acceptable. This just can't happen anymore, and we need to stop it. What we normally do when it comes to the typical business operations for making buildings green, we use a set of certifications that help regulate buildings to get them greener. And this is anything from Active House to LEED, Energy Star, WELL certification. And if you add them all up, all the points you get for doing good in your building, what we found out is 5% or less goes towards biodiversity, which would be probably the most important thing. That means preserving the landscape. That means working to make sure species don't die off, and that we consider other organisms or many other organisms. So diversity, especially biodiversity, is super important to us, and we've got to change that. So our motto is design against extinction. That's what Terreform does. Everything we're doing is to sort of fit underneath this rubric of fighting in the Anthropocene, sort of end of the world scenarios that we're seeing, at least the end for many other creatures. We should include ourselves because humans are one of the species that will go extinct. Our problem is essentially massive population increase in urban areas, and that might change due to COVID. It's also, we expect to have a number of something like 11 billion people on this planet by the end of this century. And that number fluctuates from 9 to 11, but somewhere in between, we're gonna have a lot more people everywhere in our cities. That means the food that we eat, especially meat production, is expected to double by mid-century. All those cows, pigs, chicken, and lamb. We're gonna have more vehicles and more types of vehicles on streets than ever before. It's gonna be a lot of congestion. So how do we negotiate that territory of the public realm, especially when it comes to movement? And when we think about these things all together and the multiple scales that they impact, which is the kind of work we do at Terreform ONE, we call it socio-ecological design, which means we look at the science and the engineering, especially when it comes to making things green or ecological. But even if we author those things and get it right, we have to recognize the society part. That is our capricious leadership, the public themselves, in general, folks that are out there that don't necessarily work on these things. And they're very much, they're very much need to be included in this kind of design concept. So we work with them or for them, but together we'll make an impact when it comes to thinking about our ecosystems. And this is a great kind of working sort of image of how we operate. So we have our architects and planners and our scientists that are a part of the project and do all the engineering, but we're very inclusive about folks in the neighborhood and folks in the community so that they have a direct say in thinking about the near future of our streets and our cities. So we all come together to, at least in the beginning, envision a better place. Not a perfect place, but something that's better. And we take input and questions from almost anybody. And we've been doing this for some time in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And I think Vivian's going to show this project, but I just wanted to quickly go over this. This is where Terreform ONE is located there in Brooklyn. And this is the facilities that we have. And everything is in this massive research laboratory that Vivian is going to talk about, and talk about our studios and how they operate. And the things that we work on in those studios essentially is Civilization 2.0, but it's how we move in the future, how we eat, and how we're going to live. So some of those examples would be something like this, which is vehicles that are designed to be super soft, autonomous, shared ownership models. So you hop in one car, use it, and then someone else hops in it later on. We worked on this since MIT. This is a vehicle that stands up and articulates and spins on a dime. It's It's a mobility system designed to fit cities, not cities designed around the automobile, which is what we've got the entire 20th century in America, but vehicles designed to fit cities now and their needs. And all of these things kind of holistically fit together into thoughts about the city or polemics about the city that get us to these super ecological or ultra green moments. So here we replace many of those cars with trackless trains that are also autonomous. This is 42nd Street in the near future. Riparian corridors that go through the center of our streets, teeming with all kinds of aqueous life. We've got independent lighting systems for our streets that have vertical access wind turbines and photovoltaic cells and battery packs at their base. So if another Hurricane Sandy comes in, the base infrastructure doesn't go out. And certainly a lot of vertical farming and green walls on every possible surface and facade of buildings to build in biodiversity everywhere we can in our cities. And that's the kind of the vision that we have and the vision that we fight for. We also look at the metabolism of our cities. What do they actually produce? I mean, if I was an alien from outer space and I looked at New York, I would think that New York essentially makes trash all day long. I mean, we're roughly around 36,000 tons of trash per day in the city of New York. That's just not acceptable. And this image here shows that that's in 1 hour, more trash, compacted trash, than the volume of the Statue of Liberty every single hour in the city of New York. We got to think about how we can mitigate that, stop that. So one of the things we looked at is synthetic biology, and we worked with other organisms, in this case, mycelium and acetobacter. And we thought about ending waste in this case and making things that you would either produce in a lab or you would grow. They're alive, and turn them into usable objects in our cities, in our homes. So one of the things we did is we grew a chair. This is the entire history of chair design. And we think we moved from bespoke crafted chairs, 19th century and earlier, to unitized volumes of chairs made in kind of on a production level through assembly lines, et cetera. And that's more or less the 20th century, plastics and metals. And the 21st century are things that we can actually grow in labs or materials that are alive. And that's how we came up with this chair. It's made out of essentially a biopolymer that's both the root base of a mushroom called mycelium, and then it's coated with acetobacter to help it be hydrophobic, so water doesn't affect it. This is my daughter on one of these chairs that we had designed. It's designed for kindergartens, and she's supposed to go home and tell mommy and daddy that she can eat her chair and that it's okay. Then we designed ones for adults. This is a chaise lounge. This is made out of plyboo. The ribs form a triple curved structure. It's then seeded with agricultural waste. It's placed with agricultural waste and then seeded with reishi, essentially acculturated with reishi. The reishi grows in 7 days and makes this petrified surface of mushroom, the root base of mushroom, this rhizomatic structure. And it grows into a chair that is as green as possible. It can last 10, 20 years. And when you're done with it, you throw it in a garden. And it composts directly, feeds thousands of other forms of life. So it's not an IKEA chair that you throw out, but it's a chair that's built into our ecosystems and considers this kind of upcycling or return to the earth condition that is super important when we think about green design. Other projects we have here is the Fab Tree Hab. This is growing woody plant matter into shaped or usable geometry for humans to make homes or dwellings. Here, there's no distinction between the home and the landscape. All these kinds of critters live on the outside, and they're supposed to live on the outside. And on the inside, it's like a regular home, but it's made out of grafting, or essentially putting grafting trees or woody plants and vines and willows and clusters into specified geometries. And we connect them together to make one combined or contiguous vascular system, and they grow and get thicker over time. But you have a home that slowly gets thicker, but it's connected to the landscape and is certainly accountable for the damage we've done before. And it's a whole different way of thinking about the scales of economy associated with building design. Here's how we make some of the wood that we produce here. The wood is never dead, it's alive. So we grow it in these chambers that are dark and moist. We have a single root tap with a one hormonal signature, and it constantly looks for soil, makes a big, long, wet noodle of whatever plant it is, that's the root. And then we pull it out of the chamber, these dark chambers, and we expose it to daylight and air, and it lignifies, it gets hard, and starts leaf propagation. And we fold it over a scaffold and tap it back into the soil, and we have something that we could easily shape and then allows it to grow over time and connect it to existing trees on site. So this project Fab Tree Hab is something that we think is as green as possible when it comes to buildings. And just the last couple projects I'm going to show, here is one that we were talking about earlier. This is the Cricket Shelter and Farm. This was our client for some time, this guy and tens of thousands of others. And we designed a home for crickets so that humans can eat them. Why? Well, because we can't live off of that meat, cows, pigs, chicken, and lamb. It's just too much. The United Nations has mandated that Europe and the United States needs to consider eating insect-based protein. And insect protein is really good, especially what's in a powder form. Why would you do that? Well, it's 2,000 gallons to get 1 gram of protein from a cow of water. And for the same gram of protein, it's 1 gallon. So it's a massive difference when you use crickets versus cows. It's also 300 times less greenhouse gas emissions when you eat something protein from crickets versus something like a cow. This shows you the land use difference. The one on the left is a rural condition where we have cattle, roughly 100 acres. Both are actually 100 acres of space. One is urban space, the other one's rural. And that 100 acres produces the same amount of protein as the urban space using crickets. Those little pink areas, less than, 3% of the necessary land can create the same amount of protein that you would need that the 100 acres does on the other side. So it's interesting when it comes to land use patterns, you can incorporate eating crickets and farming crickets inside our cities. So you go from pasture to plate very quickly. There's no carbon in shipping and storage. Here's some of the designs we had thought of about crickets and how they'd be integrated into a system. This is one of the farms that we have produced. There's 320 units. Each one produces a bag of chirp chips or cricket chips every 6 weeks. They die naturally inside our dialogue gate system. They live happy lives and they reproduce, and then they're harvested by people and when they're dead, and they're milled into a powder, which we think is really important because that powder makes bagels, bonbons, pasta, and whatever we feed them, that's really important because that determines the flavor of the ultimately the flour. The system is modular, so it can expand and be fit to any site. It also has natural ventilation throughout it. There's almost no mechanicals used in this system to heat or cool it. The spikes you see on the top is actually a form of wind cowl. So as vibrating columns of air move throughout the shelter, they get picked up through the top and they come out through these cowls that are then turned into an instrument or a wind horn or a cricket horn. And it magnifies the sounds of crickets chirping. So you can hear the whole colony when they're really happy, all the males performing what's called stratolation, moving their wings together. You can hear it from far away, all of them very happy and very excited, looking for females to propagate. Here's another view of it. They actually propagate inside these cricket sex pods, which are designed for males and females to meet each other and to procreate and spread their genetics throughout the entire shelter. So the sex pod is a very unique kind of system, but it helps move them longitudinally throughout the entire system. And then we had another project that's based on also food and farming and carbon. This one is called the Plug-in Ecology. And it's something that comes or shipped flat packed to your door, and you assemble it. It could be almost any size. It's a rotegrity sphere that's been milled. So it can be something like 18 feet in diameter, or it could be 4 feet. But instead of a green wall, it's a green ball for your home, for your rooftop, for your urban balcony, or an urban park. And here you make food on the outside and on the inside of these systems. So you could grow almost anything you want in these pleated surfaces. It's got 9 columns of sub-irrigation that trickle feeds these double-skinned wicks inside the pots. It grows any kind of food that you would want, but you would want stuff that's high yield, something that you would want fresh, something that you couldn't get from a cornfield or a wheat field very easily any place in the Midwest, or even parts of the Northeast. So here we're growing wheatgrass and spirulina. You can grow food on the inside as well as on the outside, and you'd have things like mint or arugula fresh for your salad, and you have a relationship between where the food comes from and when you eat it. This is the inside of the system. It's on wheels, so it can rotate to get the most amount of solar income. It also is, we have an app for it that lets you know when your food is ripe, and we also have a system to light it with grow lights. And finally, the last project we have is really very much about design against extinction. This is about saving a creature that is almost gone. It's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services is definitely saying it's an at-risk creature, if not endangered, and that is the beautiful monarch butterfly, those beautiful orange and red creatures. And here we've designed a building, regular building on the inside, but the skin of the building is designed to account for these butterflies to get a chance at life. It's a sanctuary for the monarchs. So here we plant milkweed. It's got areas for caterpillars and eggs, and then the chrysalis stage, and then eventually the adult butterflies propagate and live inside that space. The system, we have patented the system. It's modular, so it just depends on the amount of square footage for your building, and we could build it and fit almost any building, whether it's a new building or retrofit an existing building. These biotope mosaics, as we call them, can fit on the edge of your building and produce those facades. So here you are in the skin of the building. You see as you go up vertically 8 stories, the butterflies live inside there and they move in and out, rewilding the streets in the area. There's a pollinator garden on the rooftop. There's also areas in the atrium that they occupy and in the back. And all these things make up for a sanctuary to help save the monarch. We have large screens. We're sponsored by BASF and Intel. And the screens on the outside let people from across the street and far away, this one's in Lolita, New York City, know what's happening in that building. So these butterflies and their activities are rather small from 400 feet away, 500 feet away. But here those screens show the drama of their activities every day. And here's an inside view of the system. When you look out the window in your office space, you see this fantastic garden that's a habitat for the butterflies. We also have drones that are artificial butterflies, these quad rotors that were designed to service the precious living butterflies. So these drones take air quality measurements, they do population counts, and they make sure the feed is always available for the butterflies. We also have a commission for the American Museum of Natural History where we do their butterfly exhibit and where we work on feeding them. We've developed these feeders for their butterflies, and it's very exciting. We're a part of the Gilder Center. They have an entire insectarium that's coming in the new wing. That'll take another 2 more years to finish construction. But we've been working on the insectarium and butterflies with them. Also many other creatures. We work at full scale, so we work with the butterflies, test different shapes and geometries. Eventually we found shapes that are great for butterflies to perch, butterflies for mud baths, butterflies for nectar feeding, etc. We built in those geometries into these large-scale 3D prints that then are turned into molds from a zero VOC system. It's basically a silicon mold that's medical grade, so it's not dangerous for the environment, with bamboo scaffolds. From that, we've made a concrete panel that has embedded inside it fly ash. We did this with BASF. It's a product called GreenSense. It's the greenest low-embodied energy concrete you can possibly find, and you're able to make thousands of panels from those molds. And they're designed specifically for the butterflies to interface with the edges of buildings. And this is a building that would last 200 to 300 years with structural concrete, with the shape and the geometry considers what the butterflies like to do, especially drinking, which is what they often do, or resting, or mud baths. So here's a view of inside our full-scale section of the butterfly facade system that was installed at the Cooper Hewitt and the Smithsonian in Morristown. And you could see it there that this is actually a working prototype that we're now doing projects with in Switzerland and in Los Angeles with ODA to make butterfly sanctuaries almost everywhere we can. This is another view of that system, though it's a 50% window to wall ratio. So it's actually, you can look out a lot of those windows when you're inside there, and you could, some areas are blocked off. It's like a punched window effect, because here is where the concrete takes over and where butterflies need to do their thing. And then other areas are just for humans to look out of and get great views. And these videos sort of show it in situ there in the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, our monarchs hanging out inside our diagrid skin, our double skin system, and enjoying life. So that is some of the work that we're doing. Everything, again, is about design against extinction. And I think I babbled a little bit too much, so I apologize for that. But I think Vivian wants to take over now and tell us more about how we operate and the things that we're doing more behind the scenes, and also some other projects we've been involved in. So Vivian, go ahead. You're on mute.
Yes, hi. Thanks, Mitch, for unpacking that. Let me just share screen here. Okay, can everyone see this? So first of all, is the screen good? Okay. First of all, I want to thank the team at MCD, not only for hosting this webinar, but for adapting the show in these pandemic times to a virtual format so it could be accessible to all. I also want to echo a thank you to Randy Rosenberg and Artworks for Change for curating the show. We've been together now for many years, and when the show was first conceived, it's definitely a different world today. But you know, I want to thank her for asking these important questions about the role of design and architecture in coming up with solutions to make our environment more resilient. So, so on that note, I thought I would share our social impact strategy and how Terreform ONE has grown and adapted to changes over the last decade. We advance our mission through design research, education, public outreach, and consulting. At the beginning, we had a looming question about whose role is it to actually create the City 2.0, and what skill sets would be needed to navigate the complexity of the future city, or even a future street and public spaces. So Terreform was founded almost 15 years ago now on an education platform out of a need for much more radical and transdisciplinary education that reflected the growing complexity of cities. Cities need innovation and collaboration across disciplines, and the education system at the time reflected the often siloed divisions that can hamper communication and change. So our goal was to create a new profession called urbaneering. These urbaneers would be the next generation of green thinkers and doers who would be future urban leaders. Here's a conceptual look at the curriculum for urbaneering that combines ecological sciences, planning, and design. And here's a snapshot of a series of workshops, summer programs, and classes that integrate biotech, the lab approach, and DIY workshops. Here's a social impact mapping of some of the urban issues that the urbaneers have researched over the years, where the research has turned into designs and where prototypes have been fabricated. So some of these topics include, you know, garbage and waste, adaptive reuse, biodiversity, resilience, food deserts, and urban agriculture. A snapshot of one of the projects covering downtown Brooklyn, and in particular, this abandoned industrial city called the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which was once a manufacturing center for all the naval ships up until the Korean War, when it was decommissioned and lay fallow for decades. So Terreform ONE basically re-envisioned a design of the Navy Yard as a future manufacturing center, one that would be the home to inventors, creatives, entrepreneurs, engineers, where everyone would be making, designing, and fabricating using advanced fabrication techniques. And this vision that was captured in this project and series of drawings and renderings basically took on form as Terreform partnered with the developers Macrosy to turn one of the buildings, this is now called the New Lab, into what it is today. And our studio, I don't know if you can see my pointer, is right there. So the second element of our social impact strategy is about public outreach. We have three key working areas and levels of impact to deliver on our mission to advocate for socio-ecological design by engaging the public. At the individual level, we invest in people and help create the next generation of leaders and change agents in socio-ecological design. So we do this through our workshops, but our primary mechanism is our fellowship program, which was sort of a formalized version of the urbaneering program. The fellowship program now is generously supported by the R&R Foundation and the OVA Arab Foundation. Secondly, at the public level, we engage directly to spread ideas of sustainable ecology with the general public. We create public forums to spread these ideas, museum workshops, community engagement events, etc. And the cricket shelter is a great example, as many of our other prototypes and projects have gone through this museum circuits. Finally, we inspire an ecosystem by spreading ideas and thought leadership as widely as possible through active public speaking engagements, and where we also bring our fellows in to encourage them to get involved as well. So some of these exhibitions include, the Monarch Sanctuary that Mitch spoke about, Cricket Shelter, BioCity Map, and here's some of the kind of ways that we measure as a sort of think and do tank our social impact. Here's an image of some of our fellows giving a workshop on the Monarch Sanctuary, shown here at the Cooper Hewitt. And more snapshots of the people engaged in looking at and touching and feeling the molds and models that we 3D printed and made to create the Monarch Sanctuary. The third element of our social impact was our decision to really expand our reach by working with clients and stakeholders on many different levels. By working with decision makers, we felt it was an important step in expanding our social impact. So we work with cities, cultural institutions, NGOs, corporations, and developers. I'm just going to give a brief examples of each. But with the New York City Mayor's Office of Sustainability, we evaluated plans for EV charging hubs and created recommendations on how to best integrate and execute this as one of many cities whose mandate is to adopt and switch over their fleets and many other vehicles to electric. So in some examples of series of drawings and ways that we brainstormed and created a workshop for the Mayor's Office of Sustainability. The second group are cultural institutions, and I think I won't go into detail because Mitch has mentioned and shown some of these images with the Museum of Natural History. The third is the Environmental Defense Fund, where we had a really interesting a year-long engagement in researching, developing workshops, and essentially hosting 3 different cities, New York, LA, and Houston, in developing a pilot in each of the cities around hyper-local air quality monitoring using sensors and new technology. One of the things that cities really lack is standardized data on air quality. And in order to improve our environment, have that kind of social impact, cities really need to capture the data in order to change policy. So this was an important step in applying what we do and our process in engaging cities on a very particular topic. And that was sponsored, and we worked with the Environmental Defense Fund, the EDF, with that particular workshop and research project. BASF, the global chemical company, has been a long time supporter, and we've done various types of engagements with them, from summits, curation, design competitions, community engagements, and one in particular where we looked at a case study of Red Hook, Brooklyn, and how can we actually improve and increase our resilience, especially in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, using advanced materials and systems. So it was a very in-depth collaboration with the community leaders of Red Hook, Brooklyn, as well as with BASF, to come up with, to co-create a number of solutions, one of which was a model block that would offer decentralized energy, public green spaces, a community program for retraining workers, and multi-use soft development. So finally, the last collaboration is with developers, and I think this was already covered in our Monarch Sanctuary, but the initial project for Monarch Sanctuary really came through in a developer had a site with this request to conceive of the greenest building possible. And hence the Monarch Sanctuary went from design at a particular site to prototyping almost full scale, using advanced fabrication techniques, to being shown as part of the Cooper Hewitt Triennial on nature. And here's another close-up of it. So I'm just gonna end here again with this wonderful, one of our favorite perspectives of 42nd Street. It's an optimistic look, but one that I hope between our projects and social impact that we've given, we've shared some ideas on how designers, architects, and urban designers can have a real role in social impact, especially in this climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian and Mitch. Wow. I mean, the whole thing is so incredibly optimistic. That's one of the great things I love about it. And one of the things I also love is they never know when you wake up in the morning what new memes, ideas you're going to hear. And for me, it's two things. It's cricket sex pods and kids eating their chairs. I did not expect either of those when I woke up this morning. We'll go back to cricket shelter for a second, because Mitch, you said at the beginning that it sort of has taken on a life of its own. Talk a little bit about that life and what's happened, and also what have you learned about design, or bringing designs to life and the interaction with the real world, excuse me, the world of in which it's supposed to, it's intended to exist. What have you learned there?
Yeah, well, you know, thanks, by the way, Joel, for pointing out those two things: kids eating chairs and cricket sex pots. I think, we have a lot more of those things. We tone it down, and we also make a lot of mistakes. So when you ask me or ask us like what we learned, well, we do learn an awful lot from the mistakes that we make and the trials that we go through with all of our projects. I mean, at the end, you know, whether Vivian's taking her perspective on it or whether I'm showing some, you know, final glossy image, there is an amazing amount of failure that went into that before we got it right. And those projects are in many cases, they're wicked problems. So they take years to solve, and some of them don't ever actually really get solved. And I think that there's less and less of that happening in today's climate. There's just, people are more interested with taking a year or two to make a product and then getting it out there and seeing how much, you know, return on equity they can make. So we take on projects that are that definitely don't have easy answers. So when we did this thing with crickets, we had people coming after us to say, hey, do you want to get into the food business? That was interesting because we're architects. Then we've had people say, we really want to get out of the food business with you because it took 100 years to eat lobster in the United States and it was mostly fed to prisoners. So even if we invest in some large scale farming of crickets, you know, people are just not going to get over it anytime soon. So we don't know whether we got in too early or whatever the deal is. But then shortly after, Mark Zuckerberg's sister invested in Tiny Farms as a technology, which is another startup company that's essentially farming crickets for meat replacement. So that was interesting. And then we're also involved with all of these chefs that have these little parties where you essentially eat bugs and they're prepared well, and it's still really on the fringe. So we haven't.
In this country, I think it's important to point out that 80% of the world is known to eat insects in some form or another. We look at that and think, oh, well, it's either, you know, primitive people living in barely developed economies, but no, that's not the case at all.
Right. That's totally right. And actually, we're all
Yes.
eating insects. We just don't know it. So there's a certain amount that are approved.
Vivian, you're going to say something?
Oh, yes. And in fact, I did get a call just a couple weeks ago about the cricket shelter, but a couple years ago when the cricket shelter first came out, this is an inspiring story about the executive director of another NGO on the Global Orphan Foundation that basically manages and creates, you know, that they support orphans in the Republic of Congo and Colombia. And they basically were asking a lot of questions about how this cricket shelter would work, because they were inspired by the project and they decided to set up an entire insect farming system to help increase the nutrition for these orphans in the Congo. And I just checked their website before this talk, and they actually have implemented it. It's still there and it's growing. So I was very happy to see that.
Yeah. I didn't mean to interrupt your answer to that, Mitch, but is there anything else on that? So one of the things you sort of touched upon a little bit, Vivian actually did, but I think is really important to this question is, so the environmental impacts, the ecological aspects of this are critically important. I don't think anyone's going to dispute that, but also the social parts of this. You know, the mobility, those lovely turn on a dime little devices that you've created are great, but the question is, how do you make mobility accessible to everybody, those who don't have access to it now? And there's a lot of people, even in, you know, here in my town of Oakland, California, a lot of people don't have access to transit, let alone to cars, or maybe bikes aren't safe or even affordable. And so there is this access, and you talked about, I think, a little about food deserts, which gets to one part of that. But I guess, how does Terreform One think about the societal impacts of this, particularly bringing, making access to food, shelter, mobility, and all of the things that you talk about more accessible to all? Vivian, let's start with you.
Well, that I mean, that is our mission to not only advance the thinking, to use our imaginations combined with research, scientific research on these topics, but to then come up with solutions that may seem initially a little radical or, you know, or out there, but actually are really embedded in reality, whether it's current technology and, you know, like that vision of 42nd Street, it's all current technology that's embedded. But I think a lot of the future of creating access and implementing these programs and making them real really rely on the collaboration of many different stakeholders between public-private partnerships where cities and corporations really jump in and help, the funding, where inventors, entrepreneurs develop the technology and pilot. And we're seeing a lot of that actually at the New Lab through their innovation studios, where each studio is focused on exactly that, on mobilizing a current problem and finding solutions and making it real. And so, yeah, I think that the collaboration and transdisciplinary approach is really a key in making that happen.
Well, Mitch, let me home in on the question a little bit, maybe better than I did the first time. How do you bake into your design the design of the system in which this operates so that a mobility solution, for example, or a shelter or food solution becomes accessible to those who need it most?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, right now, one of the things that we are working on is called Bio Bike Box. It's essentially a mobility justice solution for downtown Brooklyn. It's located near some very long-standing housing projects that have essentially indigent communities there since the 70s. And it's essentially a super accessible bike sharing program along with a biodiversity program next to it, these kind of walls that we're doing, where it's even more subsidized than the city bike program that's out there. So this is essentially meant for people who can't even afford something like city bike. It gives them access to this. They can use it in to solve what we call the last mile problem, which is a very difficult thing in cities. You can get buses and subways to a certain area, but then you can't really get that bag of groceries or something from that last stop on the subway to your home. So here, this is a bike share program with also bikes that are freight-based bikes, so you can carry up to 400 pounds, and people are allowed to take them out at a super cheap rate, if not even free, and then they get to access the streets of New York in a way that they weren't able to do that. Even if they can afford their own bikes, they don't have apartments that are big enough to store them. So the bike box is essentially a bike shelter you find commonly in places like Amsterdam or all over Europe, but it's not prevalent in the United States. So we've looked at that. We've also have a number of programs that think about getting folks into autonomous vehicles and making information about them. They're, I guess, a new type of sort of free Uber. I can't say exactly what we're going to do, but just this is something that's launching right now. And so someone will kill me if I say it on this format. But we are working deeply to think about mobility justice in every possible form. So none of this is imagined for the 1% or the super elite. It's imagined for the everyday, the quotidian folk and the everyday people in cities, especially dense, intense urban environments.
Wondering how you view this moment. And when I talk about this moment, it's not just COVID and the pandemic. It's not just the severe economic crisis. It's not just the social justice movement that's now become such a critical factor in so many cities. And it's also, of course, it's not even all of those. It's obviously the climate crisis, which is not to be forgotten and still rearing its ugly head in many ways and just now getting going. So when we look at all of these things that are going on, how has that affected how you look at problems and how you look at solutions? Mitch, go ahead.
Yeah, no, so COVID certainly hit everyone by surprise. And we were certainly at Terreform waiting for a crisis because we thought that was the only way we're going to get any kind of change happening. We have so many ideas about green design, green business, the green economy. Green is the new gold, all of these kinds of terms, and it's been slow going. Some things have moved, but not enough and not fast enough, and certainly not to the level that we need it if we're going to solve this within 8 years, more or less, is the time frame the United Nations is giving us.
By the end of the decade, yeah.
Yeah, so if anything, what we've learned from COVID is that we're all one biology. that thing is killing every one of us. Doesn't matter what language you speak, what nation you live in, what religion you are, what your background is. It doesn't matter. We're one biology. And if we're one biology, we're on one planet. And if we're going to expect to think about development in our cities in the near future, or if we want some kind of change, or think about how people need to live in the future or go to school in the future, we're learning a lot about the impact of that one biology. And all of these kinds of kind of the medical advice we're getting, centering the stuff around health for others, it's going to have a massive shift in whether people will continue to live in dense urban environments or whether we'll move out into the suburbs. And is that a good model? And how can we make that model work and make it more energy efficient and useful than the models we've seen with cities? You know, Frank Lloyd Wright came up with the concept called Broadacre City, similar to Ebenezer Howard and Garden City. And Frank Lloyd Wright was seen, this wasn't one of his, you know, I guess it was very visionary, but didn't quite take off. Let's face it, we don't live in a massive American farm where we fly helicopters back and forth every day and drive, you know, strange three-wheeled cars. But then if you look at the trend of what's happening today, we may not want to live in cities. We may want a more peri-urban or rural condition. We actually can probably travel around, if we think about it, in quadrotors or large-scale, essentially drones that would, through computational systems, traffic-based systems, bring us to where we want to go. And those two could be shared ownership models. Then we'd have a totally different fabric of a city. The morphology would be spread out. It would be a lot greener. Spaces would be different. They'd be integrated into the Earth's metabolism. And if we have something like fuel cell vehicles, you know, in its three-wheel cars, they actually scrub the air. So the more you drive them, the cleaner the air around them gets, especially if they're reformed from renewable energies off-site someplace, wind, solar, geothermal, biomass. So we have an energy equation that's a net gain, positive model. So there the suburb would be great because the more you drive, the cleaner the air, as opposed to the opposite effect we see today. I have to stop because I will just go on fantasizing about Frank Lloyd Wright and greener cities. But you know, we're looking at turning these models upside down and back again all the time.
Well, yeah, and you have to stop because we are now officially at the top of the hour. I'm going to have to put a bow on this, but I love the optimism. I love the hopefulness of what you do. And I love the fact that you are doing things that are at once both fanciful and yet deadly serious. And so I really want to thank the work that the two of you and your many colleagues are doing at Terreform ONE. Thank you to Vivian Kuan and Mitchell Joachim. And thank you to Christina Humphreys from the Museum of Craft and Design, and to Randy Rosenberg, the curator of this exhibition from Artworks for Change. And Christina, I'll hand it back to you to wrap it up.
Thanks so much, Joel. Thank you, Mitch and Vivian, for your incredible presentations and for sharing your work with Terreform ONE. And Joel, your amazing and insightful questions have really guided this conversation. Lastly, I want to thank our members for joining us for this second virtual event. We really could not present these events without your support, and we hope you will join us again soon. With that, I will leave you all to enjoy your Fridays, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Thanks, the MCD. Thanks, guys. See ya.
Thanks. Bye.